You have heard it read in church. Maybe you were the one reading it. A long list of names, one after another. And somewhere around the fifth or sixth name, your eyes start to glaze over. Abraham begat Isaac. Isaac begat Jacob. Jacob begat Judah and his brothers. And on it goes. People shift in their seats. Someone checks their phone. The genealogies are the part of the Bible that everyone agrees can be skipped. Here is what almost no one realizes. That list of names you have been trained to tune out is the single longest unbroken narrative thread in the entire Bible. It is one continuous line, recorded across more than a dozen books, written by different authors across more than 1,500 years, that runs from the first man formed from the dust of the ground to the man hanging on a Roman cross. It survives a flood that wipes out almost everything. It survives famine. It survives slavery in Egypt. It survives the near-total collapse of a royal dynasty down to a single child hidden in a temple by his aunt. It survives 70 years of exile in Babylon. And at the end of it, in the first chapter of the New Testament, an author sits down and deliberately, carefully traces every single link of that chain back to its origin and says, here, this is the line. This is the one we have been waiting for. That is what we are doing today. We are walking the entire family tree, from Adam to Jesus. Every major link, every surprising name, every moment where the line nearly broke and somehow did not. And before we get into it, if you find value in this kind of deep dive into how the Bible actually fits together, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next one. We put out a new deep dive like this every week. And if this is the kind of content that helps you see Scripture differently, you are exactly who this channel is for. And if you are already subscribed, thank you. Seriously. Drop a like before we get started. It genuinely helps more people find this. Okay, let's go all the way back to the beginning.
Before we trace the line itself, we need to understand why anyone bothered recording it in the first place. In the modern world, a family tree is a hobby, something you do on a website in your spare time out of curiosity. In the ancient world, a genealogy was none of that. It was legal documentation. It was identity. It was the difference between belonging and not belonging. In ancient Israel, your genealogy determined which tribe you belonged to, which in turn determined where you lived, because the land of Canaan had been divided among the 12 tribes by lot in the book of Joshua. Your genealogy determined whether you could serve as a priest, because only descendants of Aaron from the tribe of Levi could serve at the altar. Numbers chapter 3 lays this out in detail. Your genealogy determined whether you had a legitimate claim to the throne of Israel, because God had made a specific promise to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7 that his line and only his line would sit on that throne forever. When the Jewish people returned from exile in Babylon, one of the first things they did was sort out who belonged where based on genealogical records. Ezra chapter 2 and Nehemiah chapter 7 both record this process in painstaking detail, including a notice that certain men who claimed to be priests could not prove their genealogy and were therefore excluded from priestly service until the matter could be resolved. Ezra chapter 2 verse 62. These sought their listing among those who were registered, but they were not found there, and so they were excluded from the priesthood as defiled. A genealogy was not sentimental. It had teeth. So when Matthew opens his gospel, the first words of the entire New Testament with a genealogy, he is not padding his word count. He is making a legal and theological claim. He is saying, here is the documentation. Here is the case. This man, Jesus of Nazareth, has a verifiable, traceable, unverifiable claim to the throne of David and to the promise made to Abraham. The genealogy is the receipt.
The line begins in Genesis chapter 5, and it begins with a deliberate choice. Genesis chapter 4 has already told us about Adam's first two sons. Cain, the firstborn, who murdered his brother Abel, and Abel, who died before he could have children. The line of Cain is recorded briefly in Genesis chapter 4. His descendants include Lamech, who is associated with violence and polygamy, and the line simply trails off. It goes nowhere. It is not the line the Bible is interested in. Instead, Genesis chapter 5 opens with the words, "This is the book of the genealogy of Adam," and it traces through a third son, a son we are told almost nothing else about, Seth. Genesis chapter 5 verse 3. When Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, after his image, and named him Seth. The phrase, in his own likeness, after his image, deliberately echoes the language used of God creating Adam in Genesis chapter 1. The image of God passed from Adam to Seth continues. The line of Cain represents one trajectory for humanity. The line of Seth represents another. And it is the line of Seth that the rest of the Bible follows. What follows in Genesis chapter 5 is a list that modern readers often find tedious, but that ancient readers would have found genuinely remarkable. Name after name, each one living for centuries. Seth lived 912 years. Enosh lived 905 years. Each entry follows the same formula. So-and-so lived this many years and had a son. So-and-so lived after that this many more years and had other sons and daughters, and he died. And he died. And he died. And he died. 9 times in this single chapter, that phrase appears. It becomes a refrain, almost a drumbeat underneath the impressive lifespans. These men lived for centuries, accomplished things we are not told about, fathered generations, and every single one of them died. The genealogy of Adam is, among other things, a genealogy of death. It is the family tree of mortality, the direct consequence of what happened in the garden in Genesis chapter 3. Death entered through one man, and the genealogy of that man is, quite literally, a list of deaths, except for one name. Genesis chapter 5, verse 24, "And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him." Every other entry in the chapter ends with, "and he died." Enoch's entry does not. He walked with God, a phrase used elsewhere in the Old Testament to describe an unusually close, ongoing relationship with God. And then, instead of dying, the text says God took him. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 5 confirms the reading that has been understood for millennia. By faith, Enoch was taken up so that he should not see death. In a chapter that is otherwise a relentless drumbeat of mortality, one man breaks the pattern entirely. He does not experience the curse of Genesis 3 in the way everyone else does. And his story is told in exactly 2 verses, sandwiched in the middle of a genealogy that most people skip entirely. The exception to the rule of death is hidden inside the part of the Bible everyone assumes has nothing to say. The line continues through Enoch's son Methuselah, the longest-lived person recorded in Scripture at 969 years, down to Methuselah's grandson, Noah. And Genesis chapter 6 opens with the corruption of the earth becoming so total that God determines to send the flood. Noah, the 10th generation from Adam through Seth, becomes the bottleneck through which the entire human race and the entire genealogical line we are tracing must pass. Every single person alive today, according to the biblical account, descends from Noah and his 3 sons. The line does not break. It narrows to a single family on a single boat, and then it continues. After the flood, Genesis chapter 10 gives us what scholars often call the Table of Nations, a sprawling genealogical record of Noah's descendants spreading out across the earth, becoming the various peoples and nations of the ancient world. It is the most expansive moment in the entire genealogical record. The line goes from one family on a boat to dozens of nations covering the known world. And then, almost immediately, Genesis chapter 11 narrows it back down again. The Tower of Babel narrative in the first part of the chapter explains why humanity, which had spread out from one family, ends up divided by language and scattered across the earth. Judgment, again, following a pattern of human pride reaching toward heaven on its own terms. But then, starting in Genesis chapter 11, verse 10, the text does something remarkable. Out of the entire Table of Nations, every people group, every emerging civilization, the genealogical thread picks out exactly one line, the line of Shem, one of Noah's 3 sons, and traces it down 9 more generations to a man living in Ur of the Chaldeans in Mesopotamia. Genesis chapter 11, verse 26, Terah was 70 years old, and he fathered Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Abram, the man who will become Abraham. Think about the scale of what just happened in the text. From the entire human race scattered across the earth into dozens of nations and languages, the camera, if we can call it that, zooms in on one family in one city and one son within that family. Genesis chapter 12 opens with God speaking to this one man. Now the Lord said to Abram,
Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. The line has narrowed from all of humanity down to a single man, and the promise attached to that single man is that eventually the blessing will widen out again to include all the families of the earth. The genealogy is not just narrowing for its own sake, it is narrowing toward a point, and that point is meant to become the source of blessing for everyone the line left behind.
Here, the genealogical line begins to display a pattern that will repeat again and again, all the way to Jesus. God does not consistently choose the firstborn. He does not consistently choose the expected heir. Again and again, the line continues through the younger son, the overlooked son, the one who, by every normal expectation of the ancient world, should not have been the one carrying the promise. Abraham has two sons relevant to this story. Ishmael, born to Hagar, Sarah's servant, the son born first, through a plan that Abraham and Sarah devised themselves when Sarah's old age made the promise seem impossible. And Isaac, born to Sarah herself 14 years later, after both of them were long past the age when children were physically possible. Genesis chapter 17, verse 19. God said, "No, but Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him." Ishmael was the firstborn. Ishmael was, by any natural reading of ancient inheritance customs, the heir. And God specifically, deliberately, by name says no. The line continues through Isaac. Not because Isaac earned it. He was an infant. The choice was made before he had done anything at all. The pattern is set in the very first generation after Abraham. The promise does not run on the logic of birth order or human merit. It runs on the logic of God's choice. The pattern repeats immediately in the next generation, even more starkly. Isaac has twin sons, Esau and Jacob. Esau is born first, by mere moments. The text tells us in Genesis chapter 25 that Jacob came out grasping his brother's heel. And before either of them has done anything, while they are still in Rebekah's womb, God tells her in Genesis chapter 25, verse 23, 2 nations are in your womb, and the elder shall serve the younger. The elder shall serve
The elder shall serve the younger. Again, the promise bypasses the expected heir. Esau, the firstborn, the stronger, the favorite of his father. The line does not run through him. It runs through Jacob, the younger twin, a man whose name literally means he grasps the heel, or by extension, deceiver, and whose early life fully lives up to that name. Jacob deceives his father, deceives his brother, and spends years running from the consequences of his own choices. And it is this man, Jacob, renamed Israel after wrestling with God in Genesis chapter 33, through whom the entire nation of Israel and the entire remainder of this genealogical line will be named and descended. By the time we reach Jacob's 12 sons, the pattern has been established 3 times in 3 generations. Seth over Cain's line, Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau. The line of promise consistently runs through the one who, by every external measure available to an observer at the time, should not have been the one. Jacob has 12 sons, who become the 12 tribes of Israel. And here, the pattern continues at yet another level. The expected line of leadership in the ancient world would run through the firstborn, Reuben. But Reuben disqualifies himself through a serious moral failure recorded in Genesis chapter 35. The next 2 sons in line, Simeon and Levi, disqualify themselves through a violent act recorded in Genesis chapter 34 and addressed in Jacob's final words to his sons in Genesis chapter 49. And so the line of leadership, specifically the line from which the future kings of Israel will come, passes to the 4th son, Judah. Genesis chapter 49, verse 10, part of Jacob's deathbed blessing over his sons. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he comes to whom it belongs, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. This is one of the earliest messianic prophecies in the entire Bible, embedded inside what looks, on the surface, like just another line in a long list of blessings over 12 sons. The scepter, the symbol of royal authority. The symbol of royal authority belongs to Judah's line, until he comes to whom it belongs. The promise points forward to someone beyond any of the immediate sons being blessed, someone still future.
And here is where the genealogy does something that should startle anyone reading carefully. The line through Judah, on its way toward David and eventually toward Jesus, includes some of the most scandalous individuals and events in the entire Old Testament. Genesis chapter 38 tells the story of Judah and Tamar. Tamar was married to Judah's son, who died. By the custom of the time, she was then married to Judah's second son, who also died. And Judah then refused to give her to his third son, fearing for his life, leaving Tamar in a kind of permanent limbo, neither fully married nor free to remarry. Tamar eventually disguises herself and conceives a child by Judah himself, who does not recognize her. When the situation comes to light, Judah declares, "She is more righteous than I, because I did not give her to my son." Genesis chapter 38, verse 26. The child born from this encounter, Perez, becomes a direct ancestor in the line leading to David. And Matthew's genealogy of Jesus includes both Judah and Tamar by name. Matthew chapter 1, verse 3. Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Generations later, the line passes through the conquest of Canaan under Joshua, and specifically through the city of Jericho, where a Canaanite woman named Rahab, explicitly identified in the book of Joshua as a prostitute, hides the Israelite spies, professes faith in the God of Israel, and is spared along with her family when the city falls. Joshua chapter 2 and chapter 6 tell her story, and Matthew chapter 1 verse 5 places her directly in the line. Salmon was the father of Boaz by Rahab. And then comes Ruth, a Moabite woman from a people group with a complicated and often hostile relationship with Israel throughout the Old Testament, who marries into the line through Boaz, the son of Rahab. The entire book of Ruth is, among other things, the story of a foreign widow's loyalty and faith being rewarded with inclusion in the line that will produce King David. Ruth chapter 4 verse 17 records the naming of her son. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. 4 generations. Tamar, a woman wronged by the very family she married into, who took drastic action to secure justice. Rahab, a Canaanite prostitute who chose Israel's God over her own people. Ruth, a Moabite foreigner who chose loyalty to her mother-in-law and to Israel's God over returning to the safety of her own homeland. And then Bathsheba, whose story comes 1 generation later in the affair that produced Solomon. A story so serious that 2 Samuel chapter 11 records it without softening any of its details. By the time we reach David, the line that will produce Israel's greatest king, and ultimately the Messiah, has run through a deceived father, a wronged daughter-in-law, a foreign prostitute, a foreign widow, and an affair that involved murder. If you were designing a genealogy to look impressive, to project an unbroken record of righteousness leading to greatness, you would not include any of this. And yet, Matthew, writing centuries later and selecting which names to highlight in his genealogy of Jesus, deliberately includes 4 of these women by name: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and the wife of Uriah, which is how Matthew chapter 1 verse 6 refers to Bathsheba, a phrasing that does not let the reader forget exactly whose wife she had been. The line to the Messiah does not run around scandal. It runs directly through it. From David, the line continues through the kings of Judah, the same line we have walked through in detail in a previous video on this channel. Solomon, Rehoboam, and onward through the roughly 20 kings of the southern kingdom, some faithful, many not, until the line arrives at one of the most theologically loaded moments in the entire genealogy. Jeconiah, also called Jehoiakim, was one of the last kings of Judah before the Babylonian exile, taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar after a reign of only 3 months. And in Jeremiah chapter 22 verse 30, God pronounces a devastating judgment on him. "Thus says the Lord, write this man down as childless, a man who shall not prosper in his days, for none of his offspring shall succeed in sitting on the throne of David and ruling again in Judah." Write this man down as childless. This is a genealogical curse, a declaration that this man's line, as far as the throne of David is concerned, is finished. And yet, Jeconiah did have children. 1 Chronicles chapter 3 lists them by name, including a son named Shealtiel and a grandson named Zerubbabel. The curse was not that Jeconiah would have no descendants. The curse was that none of his descendants would sit on David's throne again. And here is where the genealogy faces what looks, from a purely human perspective, like an impossible problem. The promise to David said his line would reign forever. The curse on Jeconiah said his line, which is by this point the only surviving line of David's descendants, would never reign again. How can both of these be true? This tension sits at the center of the genealogy for the rest of its length, unresolved, all the way until the final chapter of the story. After the exile, the line continues through Zerubbabel, Jeconiah's grandson, who leads a group of exiles back to Jerusalem and oversees the rebuilding of the temple, as recorded in the books of Ezra and Haggai. And then, for roughly 400 years, the biblical record goes largely silent on this family line. The intertestamental period, the time between the close of the Old Testament and the opening of the New, produces no biblical narrative tracking this specific family at all. The line continues. We simply are not told the details of how for 4 centuries. And then, in the opening chapter of Matthew's Gospel, the line resurfaces, and Matthew traces it generation by generation.
All the way from Abraham, through David, through Jeconiah, through Zerubbabel, down to a man named Joseph. Matthew chapter 1, verse 16. And Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called Christ. But there is a second genealogy. Luke chapter 3 also traces the line of Jesus, and the two lists do not match. From David onward, Matthew and Luke record almost entirely different names. Matthew traces the line through David's son Solomon. Luke traces the line through a different son of David entirely, Nathan, mentioned in 2 Samuel chapter 5 as one of David's other sons. For centuries, readers have proposed different explanations for this divergence. One of the most widely held views, advocated by many scholars across church history, is that Matthew is tracing the legal royal line, the line of succession to David's throne, the line that establishes Joseph's legal right to pass the Davidic kingship to Jesus as his legal son, while Luke is tracing Mary's actual biological ancestry, also traced back to David, but through a different branch of the family, establishing that Jesus is a biological descendant of David, as well as the legal heir through Joseph under Joseph. Under this reading, Matthew's genealogy answers the legal question: does Jesus have a legitimate claim to David's throne? And Luke's genealogy answers the biological question: is Jesus actually, by blood, a son of David, as the prophet said the Messiah must be? Both questions matter. Both genealogies, read together rather than as competitors, answer both. And this is where the curse on Jeconiah finds its resolution. If Jesus' legal claim to David's throne comes through Joseph, a descendant of Jeconiah, under the curse that none of Jeconiah's line would sit on the throne, but Jesus is not Joseph's biological son, then Jesus inherits the legal right to the throne through Joseph's adoption of him, as recorded in Matthew chapter 1, without being personally subject to the curse on Jeconiah's biological line, because his biological lineage, through Mary, traces back to David through an entirely different branch that was never under that curse at all. The virgin birth is not a side detail in this story. It is, among many other things, the precise mechanism by which an apparently impossible genealogical contradiction, God's unbreakable promise to David, and God's declared curse on the only surviving line of David's heirs, is resolved. Jesus receives the legal title to David's throne through a father who carries the curse without being biologically bound by that curse himself, because his biological line runs through David by an entirely different path. 2 genealogies, 2 questions, 1 answer. Matthew chapter 1 verse 1 summarizes the entire sweep of what
Verse 1 summarizes the entire sweep of what we have just walked through in a single sentence. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Step back now and look at the entire sweep of it. From Adam, through the line of Seth rather than Cain, through Noah, the bottleneck through which all of humanity passes, through Shem, one line out of the entire table of nations, through Abraham, called out of Ur, through Isaac rather than Ishmael, through Jacob rather than Esau, through Judah rather than his older brothers, through Tamar, Rahab, and Ruth, a wronged woman, a foreign prostitute, and a foreign widow, through David, an affair, and a curse pronounced on the only surviving royal line, through 4 centuries of biblical silence, to a carpenter named Joseph and a virgin named Mary in a small town that nobody expected anything from. At literally every single stage where the line could have gone the expected way,
The firstborn, the powerful, the respectable, the obvious choice? It did not. And at every single stage where the line looked like it might break entirely, Cain's violence, the flood,
Barrenness, scandal, exile, a curse of childlessness on the throne's last legitimate heir. It did not break. What does this mean for you? If your own family history has things in it you would rather not talk about, and most families do, you are not outside the pattern of how God has always worked. You are inside it. The line that produced the Messiah ran through deception, through scandal, through foreign blood, through exile, through a curse that looked on paper like the end of the promise. And God did not work around any of it. He worked through all of it, every single piece, without exception, toward exactly the outcome he had promised from the very beginning. The genealogy nobody reads turns out to be the thread that holds the entire Bible together. From the first Adam, formed from the dust of a garden, walking with God until sin entered and death began its long reign through every name on that list, to the last Adam, as Paul calls him in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, who reverses everything the first Adam's line had been recording for 4,000 years. Genesis 5 ends almost every entry with the words, "and he died." The genealogy of Jesus ends with a man who did not stay dead. That is the line, from Adam to Jesus. One unbroken thread, 4,000 years long, running through everyone and everything, and arriving, against every human expectation, exactly where God said it would.